Ladies and gentlemen, let me tell you something. Life's a journey full of trials, setbacks, and crossroads. And I know, it's not always easy to believe that the road ahead leads somewhere good. But there's a truth that's bigger than any fear, stronger than any failure, and deeper than any doubt. God will provide you. And when I say that, I'm not just talking about what you want. I'm talking about what you need, what He's planned for you. So sit tight, open your heart, and let's get into this shit, because this message is for you. Let me ask you something. How many times have you been in a situation where you felt like everything was crumbling? Maybe your job's not working out, your relationships are falling apart, or that dream you've been chasing feels so far away, it might as well be on another planet. You start to question yourself, you question the people around you, and you even question God. Why me? Why now? Why is this happening? That's where most people stop. They stop believing, stop hoping, stop trusting. But I'm here to tell you something different. Trust the process. Because God's plan is greater than your doubts. See, the thing about faith is, it's not about seeing the whole staircase. It's about taking that first step, even when you can't see where it's leading. And that's hard. I'm not saying it's not. Faith doesn't mean you won't feel fear. It means you act despite the fear. It doesn't mean you'll never have doubts. It means you don't let those doubts control your life. Trust the process. God doesn't make mistakes. He's not out here second guessing Himself like we do. He's already written the blueprint. And even when it feels like you're walking through the fire, He's refining you, shaping you, preparing you. Think about the stories in Scripture. Moses stood at the edge of the Red Sea with an entire nation behind him and an army closing in. Can you imagine how he must have felt in that moment? The fear, the uncertainty, the overwhelming sense of being trapped. But what did God say? Raise your staff. That's it. Raise the staff and trust me. And what happened next? The sea parted. The impossible became possible. But Moses had to trust first. He had to act on faith before he saw the miracle. That's what trusting God's process looks like. It's knowing that He's working behind the scenes, even when you can't see it. It's believing that every setback is a setup for something greater. It's understanding that delays aren't denials. They're part of the design. And yes, I know that's hard to hear when you're in the middle of a storm, but the storm isn't forever. You're not meant to live there. God's process is bigger than the storm. It's about the destination, but it's also about who you become along the way. When you trust God's plan, you stop fighting battles that aren't yours to fight. You stop trying to control every little detail, and you start walking in faith, knowing that He's already gone before you. That doesn't mean you sit back and do nothing. Faith without works is dead. But it does mean you stop carrying burdens that were never meant for you. Trusting the process means surrendering control. And let me tell you, that's one of the hardest things for us to do. We want to drive the car, steer the ship, write the story. But when you give it to God, when you let Him lead, you start to see that His way is always better. And don't think for a second that God's plan is small. His vision for your life is so much bigger than anything you can imagine. You're here for a purpose. your struggles, your pain, your victories, they're all part of a greater story. God didn't bring you this far to leave you. He didn't put dreams in your heart to let them die there. Trust Him. Trust the process, even when it doesn't make sense, even when it feels like you're going backward instead of forward, even when it feels like everyone else is getting their blessing and you're stuck waiting. Trust the process. God is in control, and His plan will always be greater than your doubts. Adversity is something every single one of us faces, and when it shows up, it doesn't come knocking politely. It barges in, uninvited and unwelcome, disrupting our plans, testing our patience, and shaking our faith. It's in those moments when life feels heavy and uncertain that the real challenge begins. Staying faithful in the face of adversity isn't easy. It requires a strength that doesn't come from within us. It comes from trusting God, even when everything around us seems to be falling apart. Faith isn't about pretending everything is fine. It's about believing that even when things aren't fine, God is still good, still present, and still working. Adversity has a way of making you question everything. It whispers lies into your ear, telling you that you're alone, that you're forgotten, that your situation will never improve. It feeds on your fears and magnifies your doubts. But faith doesn't operate on what you see or feel. It operates on what you know. And what you know is this: God's promises are unchanging. His love for you doesn't waver when you face hardships. He is the same yesterday, today, and forever, which means His plan for your life remains intact, even in the storm. Faith in adversity isn't about denying the pain or pretending the struggle isn't real. It's about acknowledging that while the pain is real, so is God's power. It's about holding on to the truth that His strength is made perfect in our weakness. When you're going through something hard, it's tempting to turn away from God, to stop praying, to stop believing, because you don't see the evidence of His hand at work. But faith isn't about immediate results. It's about persistence, endurance, and trusting that His timing is always perfect. Look at the life of Job, a man who faced more adversity than most of us could even imagine. He lost everything: his family, his wealth, his health, and yet through it all, he remained faithful. He didn't understand why he was suffering. He questioned, he wrestled, he grieved, but he didn't turn his back on God. And because of his faithfulness, God restored him. Job's story reminds us that faith in the face of adversity doesn't mean you won't feel the weight of the struggle. It means you choose to trust God, even when the answers aren't clear. It means you cling to Him when it would be easier to let go. Staying faithful during hardship also requires remembering who God is. Adversity can make us forget the victories we've already experienced, the ways He's shown up for us in the past. It's easy to focus so much on the current struggle that we lose sight of the bigger picture. But when you take a moment to reflect on all the times God has been faithful before, it strengthens your faith for what you're facing now. He didn't bring you through past battles just to abandon you now. The same God who made a way before will do it again. Faith in adversity also means trusting that there's a purpose in the pain. We may not always understand it, and honestly, we're not meant to. God's ways are higher than our ways, and his thoughts are higher than our thoughts. What looks like a setback to us may actually be a setup for something greater. What feels like a delay may be God's way of protecting us or preparing us for what's next. Adversity often becomes the soil where provision often comes in ways we don't see coming, in ways that don't align with our plans or expectations. It's one of the most humbling and faith-building aspects of trusting God. We have a tendency to look for answers in familiar places, to expect solutions that fit within the box we've created for how life is supposed to work. But God doesn't operate within our limits. His ways are higher than ours, and his provision is often wrapped in circumstances or people we least expect. Think about the story of Elijah and the widow at Zarephath. Elijah was in a desperate situation, running from a famine and in need of food and water. God didn't send him to a palace or to a wealthy benefactor. He sent him to a widow who had almost nothing. She was preparing to eat her last meal with her son and then wait to die. To the human eye, she was the least likely person to provide for Elijah. But God used her obedience to perform a miracle that sustained them all. The jar of flour and jug of oil didn't run dry, and what seemed like an impossible situation turned into one of abundance. That's how God works. He doesn't need your situation to make sense. He just needs your trust. Provision can also come in forms that don't look like blessings at first. Sometimes it looks like closed doors, detours, or even losses. It's only in hindsight that we realize those moments were God protecting us or guiding us to something better. We might be praying for one thing, but God knows what we really need. He sees the gratitude is one of the most powerful and transformative forces we can cultivate in our lives. It shifts our perspective, changes our attitude, and opens the door for blessings that we might not even recognize otherwise. It's not just about saying thank you for the good things. It's about developing a heart posture that acknowledges and appreciates the presence of God in every situation, no matter how big or small. Gratitude isn't tied to what you have or what's happening around you. It's rooted in the recognition that God is always working for your good, even in ways you may not immediately understand. When you live with gratitude, you begin to see life differently. You stop focusing solely on what's wrong and start noticing what's right. You stop measuring your worth by what you don't have and start appreciating what you do. Gratitude has a way of magnifying the good, and when you magnify the good, you start to notice blessings in places you might have overlooked. That's the power of gratitude. It's not about changing your circumstances. It's about changing how you see them. And when your perspective changes, your whole life changes with it. The Bible tells us over and over again to give thanks in all circumstances. Not just when things are easy, not just when life feels good, but in all circumstances. Gratitude isn't conditional, it's a choice. It's a decision to trust that God's plan is perfect and that every season of your life serves a purpose. Even in the midst of trials, there are blessings to be found if you're willing to look for them. Gratitude shifts your focus from what's lacking to what's present, from what's missing to what's already been provided. It's a reminder that no matter how hard, one of the most powerful examples of God's perfect timing is the story of Abraham and Sarah. God promised them a child, but they waited years, decades before that promise was fulfilled. In their impatience, they tried to take matters into their own hands, which only led to heartache and complications. But when God's time finally came, Isaac was born, and the promise was fulfilled in a way that only God could orchestrate. This story reminds us that while waiting can be difficult, God's promises never fail, and his timing is always worth the wait. It's not just about the outcome. It's about what happens in the waiting. Waiting teaches us to trust God more deeply, to rely on him instead of our own understanding, and to grow in faith. It strips away our illusions of control and reminds us that we are not in charge, he is. And in that surrender, we find peace. When we stop fighting against the waiting and start embracing it as a part of God's plan, we open ourselves up to experiencing his grace and provision in ways we couldn't have imagined. God's timing is also about protection. Sometimes the things we pray for aren't given to us right away because we're not ready for them. A blessing given too soon can become a burden. God knows what we can handle and when we can handle it, and he won't give us more than we're prepared to steward. What looks like a delay to us is often God's way of ensuring that we're ready to receive what he has in store. His timing is not about withholding blessings. It's about giving them at the perfect moment when they will truly benefit us and glorify him. Provision from God isn't always about making life easier or more comfortable. Sometimes the way God provides is designed to help us grow, to challenge us, and to shape us into the person he has called us to be. Growth and comfort rarely go hand in hand. In fact, it's often in the most uncomfortable moments, in the seasons where we feel stretched and challenged, that God's provision is most evident. It doesn't always come in the way we expect or want, but it always serves a greater purpose than just meeting our immediate needs. When we think of provision, we often picture abundance or an immediate solution to our problems. We want the answers to our prayers to come in ways that feel easy, relieving, or straightforward. But God isn't just concerned with solving our problems, he's concerned with refining our character. He doesn't just want to give us what we want, he wants to give us what we need to grow into the person he's created us to be. And sometimes that means his provision comes in the form of challenges, lessons, and experiences that stretch us beyond our comfort zone. Consider the story of the Israelites in the wilderness. After being freed from slavery in Egypt, they didn't step directly into the promised land. Instead, they spent 40 years wandering in the desert, relying on God for their daily provision of manna. That season of provision wasn't about comfort, it was about growth. It was about teaching them to depend on God, to trust his guidance, and to develop the faith and strength they would need to enter and conquer the land he had promised them. The wilderness wasn't easy, but it was necessary for their growth. God's provision often forces us to face our limitations and depend on him in ways we might not have otherwise. It's in those moments when we feel inadequate or overwhelmed that we learn to lean on his strength instead of our own. Growth requires a level of discomfort because it pushes us out of the familiar and into a place where we have to trust God more deeply. He uses those moments to shape our character, to build our resilience, and to teach us lessons that we wouldn't learn if everything was easy. Sometimes provision comes in the form of opportunities that stretch us. It might be a new job that challenges our skills, a relationship that forces us to grow in patience and humility, or a situation that tests our faith and endurance. Those moments may not feel like blessings at first, but they are part of God's provision for our lives. They are His way of equipping us for the next chapter, of preparing us for the bigger plans He has in store. Growth often requires us to step into uncomfortable situations and trust that God is using them for good. Provision that leads to growth also teaches us gratitude. When we go through difficult seasons and experience God's provision in unexpected ways, it changes how we see the world. We begin to appreciate not just the blessings, but also the challenges that brought us closer to Him. It helps us see that His provision isn't just about what we receive, but also about who we become in the process. Growth stretches our capacity to trust, to love, and to serve. And that is a form of provision that lasts far beyond temporary comfort. God's provision is also about helping us develop a greater dependence on Him. When everything in life feels easy, it's tempting to rely on ourselves and forget our need for God. But when we're pushed out of our comfort zones, we're reminded that we can't do it all on our own. Those moments teach us humility and draw us closer to Him. They remind us that His grace is sufficient and that His power is made perfect in our weakness. That reliance on Him is a gift, even if it doesn't feel like it at the time. Growth-centered provision also builds perseverance. The challenges we face and overcome through God's provision prepare us for future obstacles. They equip us with the strength and resilience to handle what's ahead. God knows what we need to endure and thrive in the long term, and sometimes that means allowing us to go through situations that stretch and strengthen us. It's not about punishing us or making life difficult. It's about preparing us for the fullness of His plan for our lives. When we begin to see provision as an opportunity for growth instead of just a source of comfort, our perspective shifts. We start to recognize the ways God is working in our lives, even in the challenging moments. We see that the discomfort we feel is often a sign of progress, of God moving us forward, of Him shaping us into the person He's called us to be. Provision isn't always about ease. It's about transformation. God doesn't just want us to stay the same. He wants us to grow, to learn, and to step into the fullness of His purpose for our lives. Waiting is one of the hardest seasons to endure, especially when it feels like nothing is happening and the silence seems deafening. In those moments, it's easy to feel overlooked, as though your prayers are going unanswered and your struggles are unseen. But the truth is, you are never forgotten, even in your waiting. God sees you. He knows your heart. Even when it feels like nothing is moving, He is working behind the scenes in ways you cannot see, orchestrating everything according to His perfect plan. Waiting can feel isolating, like you're the only one left behind while everyone else seems to be moving forward. But God is with you in that place. His presence is constant even when you don't feel it. He hasn't abandoned you or turned his back on you. In fact, those moments of waiting are often the times when he is closest to you, whispering reminders of his love and care. The waiting isn't a sign of neglect. It's a sign of preparation. God is using this season to mold you, to strengthen you, and to draw you closer to him. There's a temptation to equate waiting with inactivity, to assume that because you can't see progress, nothing is happening. But God is always working, even when you don't understand how or why. Sometimes waiting is his way of protecting you from something you're not ready for. Other times, it's his way of aligning circumstances in your life to prepare you for the blessings he's planning to give. You may not see the movement, but that doesn't mean it's not happening. Like seeds planted in the ground, growth often takes place in the unseen before it becomes visible. When you're in a season of waiting, it's easy to question your worth or wonder if you've done something wrong to delay God's plans. But God's timing isn't about punishment or reward, it's about purpose. He hasn't forgotten you because his love for you is unchanging. He's not waiting to see if you'll earn his favor or prove yourself worthy. You already have his favor and you are already loved beyond measure. The waiting isn't about what you lack. It's about what he's building within you. The waiting is also a time for refining. God often uses these seasons to teach patience, perseverance, and faith. Waiting forces you to depend on him instead of your own understanding. It pushes you to dig deeper into your relationship with him, to seek him not just for answers, but for who he is. In the waiting, you learn to trust his character, to rely on his promises, and to rest in his sovereignty. The process may feel long, but it's never wasted. Every moment of waiting has a purpose, even if it's not immediately clear. You are never forgotten because God's plans for you are written in his heart. He knows every detail of your life, every step you'll take, and every moment you'll face. His timing isn't random or careless. It's intentional and precise. He knows what you need and when you need it. He sees the bigger picture that you can't yet comprehend. While you're waiting, he's preparing the right people, opportunities, and circumstances to come together at exactly the right time. In the waiting, God's faithfulness doesn't waver. Even when you feel like nothing is happening, he's still providing for you in ways you may not recognize. He's giving you strength to endure, peace to calm your heart, and grace to keep going. Every breath you take is a reminder that he's sustaining you, carrying you through the waiting with his love and care. He's not absent. He's active, even if it's in ways you can't yet see. God doesn't forget his promises and he doesn't forget his children. The waiting may test your patience, but it doesn't negate his love or his plans. You are always on his mind, always in his care. The silence you feel isn't a sign of abandonment. It's a space where he's working things out for your good. His ways are higher. His thoughts are greater, and his timing is perfect. No matter what you are facing, no matter how uncertain or difficult life may seem, hold on to this truth. God will provide for you. He is faithful, he is good, and his love for you is unchanging. His provision may not come in the way you expect or at the time you desire, but it will always come in the way that is best for you. Trust his timing, trust his ways, and trust his heart. He sees your needs, hears your prayers, and knows your deepest desires. Lean on him, keep the faith, and remember that his grace is sufficient. God will provide.